This is one of those legends that stay with you till you're much older and sometimes never leave. It's also the reason many children, particularly West African children, are afraid to set foot in large bodies of water. There was an incident that spoke to us in childhood. We were at the beach of a beautiful island which I loved to go to. It had beautiful sand and the water was so clear. I loved to walk off on my own and explore, collecting seashells and debris that had washed up. However, I stayed away from the water's edge unless accompanied by my nanny or someone older. That day, we sat and sipped on some coconut juice as the waves came to and fro. We noticed a commotion had built up a distance away. A young girl was missing and had completely disappeared. She'd been standing close to the water's edge as she walked with her siblings, yet she was gone as though spirited away. In the Western world, she is a creature adored by adults and children alike, but growing up in Nigeria, a mermaid, or mami water as she is known, is a water spirit that is as feared as she is revered. When I was younger, nannies used to advise me not to go too close to the water's edge, lest I get caught and never seen again. I recall a rumour going round once that some men who had gone off in a boat had been captured by the mami water during a torrential storm. I've been obsessed with large bodies of water and torrential rain ever since. Mami water is popular in southeast Nigeria among the Efik, Ibibio, Igbo and Anang people. The woman who used to watch me as a child and tell me the stories to keep me in line and close was from the Igbo tribe. Now, as a Yoruba person, I'm from none of these tribes, but we're all a superstitious people, and it didn't stop our imagination taking over as the folklore spread throughout the region. With a female human upper half and a serpent lower half, mami water symbolizes the good, such as good fortune, wealth and healing, but also the bad, such as threat of destruction and death. In some other tales, mami water is fully human in appearance, though never human, if you know what I mean. The existence and spiritual importance of mami water is deeply rooted in the ancient traditions and mythologies of the coastal southeastern Nigerians. Compared to her aesthetically pleasing Western fairy tale counterpart, mami water is sometimes depicted with a snake around her neck, which represents both divinity and the art of divination. Other times she may try to pass as completely human, wandering busy markets or going to bars. She may also manifest in a number of ways. According to a Nigerian tradition, male followers may encounter the spirit in the guise of a beautiful woman, albeit sexually promiscuous woman, such as a prostitute. In Nigeria, popular stories, mami water is shown to seduce favored male devotees and then show herself to them following coitus. She then demands his complete sexual faithfulness and secrecy about the matter. Acceptance means wealth and fortune, but rejection spells the ruin of his family, finances, and his life. She is always celebrated near to and in water through communal transformative rituals of music and dance that transferred history and memories from the African continent. The mami water tradition survived the centuries-long slave trade system and entwined with elements of Caribbean worship, continues to express itself in a variety of ways across the Americas. The stories of her snatching children from their mothers in their homes in West Africa followed her across the Atlantic to the Americas. It makes Mami Waters' role as a protector of mothers and children especially poignant. Her worship created a sense of strength and unity to fight against enslavement and retain respect for women as healers and leaders. Another interesting aspect of the Mami Water deity is her connection to healing. If someone comes down with an incredibly languorous illness, Mami Water often takes the blame. The illness is evidence that Mami Water has taken an interest in the afflicted person and that only she can cure him or her. Similarly, several other ailments may be attributed to the water spirit. In Nigeria, for example, she takes the blame for everything from headaches to sterility. In fact, barren mothers often call upon the spirits to cure their affliction. Many traditions hold that Mami Water herself is barren, so if she gives a woman a child, that woman inherently becomes more distanced from the spirit's true nature. Traders in the 20th century carried similar beliefs with them from Senegal to as far as Zambia. Till today, Mami Water is very real. Now, going back to my childhood incident, as we searched for the girl, there were a few murmurs of Mami Water as people scoured the beaches in pairs, with the non-believers uttering such words as rubbish. That incident somehow solidified the myth in my mind, and even though I know it to be a myth, I still treat the deity like she is real. We never did find out what happened to the little girl, but I like to think that she's resting somewhere peacefully, warm, protected, and loved. In celebration of the darker months, I thought I would tell a few stories that, although were chilling at the time, have inspired my work in more ways than I could ever imagine. This is one of those stories. Now, this story is one that actually happened, so it fits nicely under a writer's life. This is a story of the man who came to dinner, but was never invited. In Nigeria, I grew up in the city of Lagos. It was a sprawling, busy city that was sometimes more chaotic than it needed to be. Although based in the south of the country, bordering Yoruba land, the ancient homeland of the Yoruba people, it was a mix of all the tribes, as people flocked to the city to make money. Back then, it was just rich and poor. There was no burgeoning middle class as there is now. When I say rich, I mean extremely wealthy. You had people who had property abroad and in the city, drove luxury cars, and helicopter trips to the airport were the norm. And on the other side were people sleeping on the streets and many suffering with mental health issues. They were also the majority, although we liked to think they weren't. The large disproportion in wealth seemed to go ignored as the city moved on in gaiety and desperation. We tried to deal with the encroaching poverty by building higher fences, taller gates, recruiting security guards, mobile police. I had family members who had their own armed guards, and mobile police were a very real thing, following certain family members around. We all had our own way of dealing with the inequality caused partly by decades of government incompetence and greed, which had eroded the city's universities and public education system. The money was now in top boarding schools and private institutions, which, as we all know, only the wealthy could afford. As the gap between rich and poor increased, the walls only grew taller and more reinforced. This was our way of keeping ourselves safe in an era of great uncertainty. However, one day those walls were breached, and we had an unexpected visitor. It was late evening in the family home in Nigeria, and it was just about dinner time. It was approximately 7 in the evening, and outside the crickets chirped in the warm night. Our home was arranged in an odd fashion, with a separate annex quite a distance away from the main house. It was separated by about 100 meters of lush garden, lots of trees, and huge bushes. That evening I'd chosen to hound my mother, who decided to have her dinner away from the family and in the annex. It was very dark outside, with a few lights dotted around the paths and walkways to guide our way to and fro. I'd gone into another room and was flipping through the pages of a book when I heard my mother's cutlery hit her plate. For some reason, the sound caught my attention. It was very resolute. There was a finality to it. The silence that followed was bone-chilling. How could it be my mother was sitting there perfectly still? I knew something was wrong. I sat in the other room waiting for her to move again, but everything was still, and I knew my mother well enough to know something or someone had caught her attention. I meekly emerged from the adjacent room and whispered to my mother, who came into view, "What is it?" But she didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the large glass sliding doors. She was looking to the outside, but it was all pitch black. I wondered what she saw that I didn't. And then, out of the darkness, I saw a slight movement. It wasn't a plant or an insect. It was very human. I realized it was a large human figure, partially melded to the shadows and darkness around it. We both remained transfixed, my mother not saying anything at all. Someone was standing outside and watching us. It was then I realized the sliding door had not been locked. "Mummy," I whispered, "what should we do?" As if to show us what we were up against, the figure in the shadow stepped out into the light. The man was tall and looked pretty strong. He simply stood there, staring at us as we gawped at the silhouette in shock. We were trapped. No one would have plans to come to the annex anytime soon. The rest of the family were enjoying their dinner across the garden, and the security guards did their lap every 20 minutes, and a lot could have happened by then. My mom did not respond to me for the first time in a long time. It was as though she had nothing to say. She just stood there, watching him. Together we watched the silhouette. His hair formed into a huge afro, with the ends of it matted into coils. At the time, I was fascinated by the idea of locked hair. "Don't worry, he wouldn't try to come in," my mother said. I was perplexed as to how she knew that. How did she know he wasn't some dangerous person, intent on causing havoc? By the time the rest of the neighborhood were aware of our screams, it would be too late. We watched each other for a while. My heart thundered at first, but then gradually returned to a normal state. The more he stood there watching, the more it dawned on me that my mother was right. He meant us no harm. Back then, we had practically no mental health resources, and mental health and homelessness was something reserved for the poor. Much of society didn't seem to understand it, nor seek to. We tried to separate ourselves from it all, as we pushed the responsibility further down the ranks. The stigma of it all fell with them, not us. The visitor observed us for a while longer. Then, as if he was done communicating, he melted back into the darkness, stepping off the path into the bushes. We weren't sure if he was still present. Was it a ruse to get us to emerge? However, moments later, the dogs in the next house started barking, a sure sign he was on the move. The barking led our own dogs to emerge from the other end of the garden, barking in response. The stranger was gone. I'd like to say it was an adventure of some sort, or some chilling moment in my history, but rather, it was more of a lesson. Couldn't ignore the problem, no matter how many security gates and fences we put up. The walls and boundaries would not keep the problems away. Those problems were still out there, and would still be out there. You could ignore them, but eventually they would come knocking. And they would not be as chivalrous as this gentleman was. In a few of my books, I have moments where intrusions come, unexpected and uninvited to my characters. When I write those scenes, it's always to invoke a feeling of disquiet. It's never an all-out fear. It's never violent or raucous. It's always quiet and chilling and deadly as it grows into all-out terror. There's something my mother said that night that still sticks with me. He chose to be nice to us. He made a choice. We did not. The choice was never ours to make. And back then I never understood what she meant by that statement. But now I realize that with every human lies that choice. Some would consider the events terrifying, but for me it was a good introduction to character arcs and the possible paths characters could take over the course of books. I hope you enjoyed it. I really don't know why the inspiration for these stories comes so late in the evening. It's currently 9:16, and I've suddenly experienced a frightening moment. I've been reminded of a story that I was told by a nanny several years ago. I used to think it wasn't real, but now I'm not so sure. This is the legend of the bush baby. Different legends and urban myths mean different things to different people, but to me, this became real and a sort of nightmare. The bush baby is called by its name because its cries sound like those of an actual human baby. The cries of the baby are supposed to lure unsuspecting people to danger and eventually their demise. Although the bush baby sounds very human and fragile, its cries being sweet and painful and therefore difficult to resist, it is supposed to be extremely dangerous. It apparently consumes humans and leaves nothing behind but bones and clothing. When I was about 9 years old, I ran away from home. I don't recall what caused me to flee. It would have been something minor, such as an argument, usually with my grandmother. Or I was probably told no, I couldn't have something. So I decided to run away rather than risk any further ill treatment. I was found within a short time. I hadn't gotten very far and was promptly marched back home. It was almost my bedtime, so I prepared for bed. I got into bed and picked up the book my mother was supposed to read. Little did I know she was so irritated by my stunt. She wasn't coming. There was a little knock at my bedroom door, and my nanny came in. Her name was Antonia. She was from the southeast of the country, quite beautiful and with completely hypnotic eyes. My mother had always found her odd, saying she gave her the chills. However, my mother was naturally suspicious of people. It was in her nature. I was slightly surprised at the sight of Antonia. She didn't usually tuck me in. "Are you going to read me a story?" I asked. I had the tendency to brush aside my wrongdoings. "I have something better," Antonia replied. "I'll tell you a real story. There is a home for troubled and abandoned children in my village, in the heart of Imo State." I knew of her state and the area she was from. They had some of the best storytellers in the country. "In this children's home," she continued, "the children always came in before a certain time, as it wasn't always safe to be out." Her voice drifted off. She'd piqued my curiosity. Why? What would happen? She gave me a strange look. "There is a lot that goes on, and a lot that you don't understand. You live in a busy city, but this was the outskirts of a village, near a forest. There were stories of children going missing and completely disappearing, never to be seen again. That night, after ushering all the children indoors, they heard a scream. It was low but shrill, as though it was supposed to be heard by only a few people. They said it was a baby crying. There was a debate about what to do. The more superstitious amongst them wanted to leave it, while the others had empathy. What if it really is a baby? Why would a baby be left out at this time? There are no newborn babies nearby, and there are no babies in this home. Well, it turned into a heated debate. But as is usual with so many, it is difficult to listen to the sound of a baby crying and ignore it. No one can ignore those whimpering cries. 2 people volunteered to go out when the baby's cries penetrated the air. More persistent and shrill this time. The doors were opened and they left, but the doors quickly locked behind them. Moments passed, but nothing happened. No knocking on the door to be let back in. However, the cries had stopped, and the night was deathly silent. The minutes got longer, and another volunteer wanted to go out and look for them. Perhaps they had gotten lost or gone to find the mother of the baby. But that didn't make any sense. The plan had been to go out, find the baby, and bring the baby back indoors. They could find the parents when daylight returned. Eventually, it was agreed that another volunteer could go outside, but with conditions. They were never to stray from the entrance of the home. The volunteer stood outside the door with a light in hand and shone it around, but there was nothing, no sign or sound of a baby. The two volunteers had disappeared. They didn't respond to calls, and they wouldn't and couldn't have gone far. The sound of the baby crying had completely died down, and no matter how much they called out, nothing was heard in the surrounding area. Instead, there was a dead silence. The volunteer came back in, shivering, even though the night was warm. The doors were quickly bolted shut for the night, and it was decided 2 people would stay awake, just in case. They weren't quite sure what had happened, but something unnatural definitely happened, and the others were not coming back. They also knew it had been a trap to lull them into a false sense of security and get them to emerge from the safety of the home. It is said that a bush baby will never enter your home, but instead will trick you into leaving the safety of it. It is also said nothing was ever found of the volunteers or the mystery baby. Searches were conducted with help from the nearby towns, but nothing. There were bone remnants that were human, but that was all that remained. This story was so chilling, especially before bedtime, that I've never forgotten it. There's also a saying that goes, "A baby's cry is the sweetest thing to hear, but it's midnight in the forest, and you slowly realize you don't have a baby." Thank you for listening. I love you all. I'm going to tell a story that I was told in childhood over and over again. This story is one that has made me very wary and respectful of trees. Today we're going to look into the Iroko tree. To some, it is just a tree, but to the Yoruba tribe, it is so much more. Most of the west coast of Nigeria is covered in a species of tree, scientifically known as Chlorophylla excelsa. If you've been to this region, chances are you've come across this tree. Iroko is a hardwood, usually with a lifespan of about 500 years, on the west coast of Africa, in countries such as Ghana and Nigeria. It is very durable and has been used in construction, furniture making, boat building, and other builds that require strength. It is widely believed the Iroko tree is inhabited by a spirit who frightens all who visit. The story seems somewhat similar to that of the grumpy old man who doesn't want to be disturbed and always chases visitors away. But the spirit's goal is to frighten and to terrify. Apparently, the old legends say that the spirit in the Iroko tree lives right at the top of the tree, reaching the dizzying heights as he looks down upon the visitors. Now, the Iroko man is not the only spirit present in the tree, however. There are others whose job is to prevent Iroko descending beneath the earth's core and causing havoc. Now, I don't know much about wood, but Iroko is a pretty strong wood. It's an African hardwood, so woodcutters are usually very tempted to cut the tree and make use of the wood to construct furniture. But it's considered unlucky, as it causes the man within the tree to be very angry. Usually, misfortune is placed upon the woodcutters and their families. Apparently, a prayer or some form of reverence can be offered to the tree to protect any woodcutters who try to cut down the tree. But does this work? It has also been said that in some houses that have furniture constructed from Iroko wood, the inhabitants are never given a moment's peace, as the wood is constantly groaning and creaking, as the spirit of the Iroko man within the wood struggles to be free. All the man wants is to wander the forest treetops once more, free to terrorize and frighten the inhabitants. In March of 2018, there was an incident in a small village in Edo State in Nigeria, where mysterious deaths began to occur. Some believed it was a curse, placed by the father of the sitting Oba. However, there were many others who were of the firm belief that the felling of a few sacred Iroko trees were behind the deaths. However, these Iroko trees had been cut after a 14-day prayer session, and the locals believed they were immune to any repercussions. Interestingly, only the locals behind the felling of the trees were succumbing to these mysterious deaths. A chief priest said, and I quote, "Those who cut the tree are the ones crying. They need to appease the gods for their own safety. If not, they will continue to die." The Iroko man is not just a grumpy old man, as we are led to believe. As legend has it, all who come face to face with him go mad and die a slow, painful death. The following story is based on African urban legend and has tales of miscarriage and child loss. Viewer discretion is advised. As children, we are constantly molded by what we see, what we hear, what we experience. Those experiences and those events shape us for the rest of our lives. When we think of stories from the African continent, we think voodoo and blood magic. But really, a lot of the stories are pretty tame to tell, and we do believe more in spirits. As a writer, I believe that what I experienced in my early life and what I was told has influenced me more than I will ever realize. These stories and experiences either inspire me, scare me, or make me more superstitious. This is one of those stories. This is a story of Abiku. Abiku are spirit children who are born to die. Deep in southwest Nigeria, in Yoruba land, we believe that Abiku are spirit children that are born and then die. They either die early on in life, or the mother constantly miscarries. We believe that they are born, then die young, as an infant or a child, only to be born again and die again, in a repetitive cycle, always to the same mother. It can be quite a traumatic ordeal. A family will know whether or not they possess an Abiku, as the mother constantly miscarries. They have stillbirths, or the deaths constantly recur. This is now slightly controversial, as we know that miscarriages happen for many reasons. It is said that some families believe that if they have Abikus in their midst, they find out if their suspicions are true by giving them a scar somewhere on the body. If the child dies and another child is born with similar markings, then that child is an Abiku and an evil spirit. Having an Abiku born into a family is torturous for that family, as in cases where the child is actually born, a bond is formed between mother and child before the child eventually dies. Urban legend says that in some villages, and I was told this as a child, that if you don't come in, the Abiku will get you, as there is always one nearby. This was a story told to keep wayward children indoors, particularly when it got dark. There is also the rumor that Abikus prefer the spirit world to our world because they are constantly being reborn into our world, but wish to return to the spirit world as fast as they can. There are ways to ground Abiku spirits to our realm by offering sacrifices in the form of fruit, palm kernels, but they have to be burnt at a shrine rather than just placed there. Apparently, there is one way of keeping the child separated from the spirit. That is with the aid of the goddess Oshun, the goddess of fertility and reproductive organs. She has a shrine in Oshobo, a region in Yoruba land, and is able to separate the spirit from the child. This requires a large offering though. Some theories abound about why Abiku might be born into a family. The first is jealousy, particularly from someone outside the family. This is usually in the form of a curse placed upon the family. The second is a slightly more terrifying reason. The Abiku is someone who has been wronged in the past and wishes untold suffering to the family. And finally, the third reason, which paints Abikus as playful, mischievous spirit children who just want to go in and out of spiritual realms and back and forth as they please. They have no idea of the pain or suffering that they cause and have a lack of empathy. The term mischievous undermines who they are and the trouble and suffering they cause. It makes them seem less threatening, but any spirit that is able to be born into a family and kill the child when it wants to depart is evil. The last theory is a story a lot of us were brought up with. Abiku were explained away as playful little spirits who played mischievous games, but they are anything but playful. The spirit realm is supposed to be beautiful, and apparently Abikus, on reaching our world, yearn to be back home in the peace and solitude of their world. To keep an Abiku in this world, they have to be comforted, cuddled, protected and loved. It is believed that you have to give the offering to the spirit, and this has to be done at a shrine. If the spirit feels satisfied with the offering, the spirit leaves and the child remains. Have you ever seen a man burned to death? I have. I've always been unsure whether to tell the story, but it does hark back to old practices which are no longer allowed. Not that they were allowed back then, but that's a different story. It's just, I suppose authorities are no longer allowed to turn a blind eye to such atrocities. I eventually thought it represented a time in our history where we took justice into our own hands. So I thought, why not tell it? Growing up in Nigeria was a multitude of different experiences. It wasn't just school and family, but so much more. It was an adventure, a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. The eccentricities and superstitions interwoven with the various traditions and tribes, with their own individual and unique folklore, myths, and traditions were enchanting. I grew up in a dictatorship, and whilst there was nothing romantic about it, it was a time of great change, as we had coup after coup, and would observe with amusement as a new regime change came in. I guess for me it was fascinating, but you can always look upon these events with wonder and fascination when you are living very comfortably and your freedoms aren't restricted. So, on to the story. On this day, it was a sunny afternoon, very normal in that part of the world. My mother, myself, and the driver were headed to the house of relatives on Victoria Island, and there was good news as there was to be a wedding, and there is nothing Nigerians love more than weddings and celebration. I was particularly excited as I'd been chosen to be a flower girl, and I was going to get fitted for a dress. It would be so much fun, as I would see relatives and cousins I hadn't seen for many months. And that's when, in these moments of euphoria, life happens and reminds you of the stark realities. As we were turning a corner, the junction that would take us past the Atlantic Ocean, or the Bight of Benin, There was a change in the air. My mum must have noticed, as she put her hand on my knee and squeezed. The driver glanced at us in the rearview mirror, as though wanting to see if we'd noticed the undercurrent, but there was nothing to be seen. Everything seemed calm, at first. There were a few roadside sellers and people carrying goods, loitering by the roadside, all very normal, but the feeling in the air persisted. I guess the universe, fate, God, whatever or whomever you believe in, tries to prepare you for the worst. I glanced across the wide road at the ocean, where the waves crashed against the sand. It was also peaceful, yet the air was still. Then, a low exclamation came from the driving seat. The driver's voice was low, and he tried to keep his tone calm and non-urgent. But I was no fool. I spoke and understood the local language. "What is happening?" he muttered in Yoruba. He told my mother to look up ahead. His voice was calm. I knew what that meant. They were trying not to get my attention. A small crowd was gathering. At first glance, it looked like just a gathering, perhaps a meeting on the beach, teenagers playing sports. But as we looked closer, the car still moving, we realized it was a crowd surrounding one person, and that person was not being let go. I instantly knew what was going on. I wasn't so naive or young that I didn't realize he had angered the crowd. This was mob mentality in action, and we were about to witness it firsthand. We scanned the horizon for a police officer, but there was no one who could stop the man being punished. Back then, the justice was rather archaic, a life for a life, an eye for an eye. But as we were about to learn that day, the scales of justice were not in his favor. "What do you think he has done?" my mother asked. "Probably stolen," the driver responded. "What will they do with him?" The driver paused, as though carefully contemplating his answer. "The closest station is about 3 miles away. I doubt they will walk that distance in this heat." The driver's hands clenched the steering wheel as he focused straight ahead. "It is out of our hands now." I felt the terror rise in my mother. She wasn't one for violence. So are they going to beat him up? Her voice was almost hopeful. My mother, bless her, did try to cover my eyes, but she has the smallest, daintiest hands, and I was not about to be denied the chance to witness this. I peeked through her fingers as the chaos unfolded. A few drivers passing by had slowed in horror and were calling out to them to stop, but no one was going to take on an angry mob. The tires were tossed around him with athletic efficiency, and from quite an impressive distance. The baying mob had him surrounded. A few cars had joined us in the middle of the road, and what happened next took mere seconds, and no one was prepared. Someone was frantically pouring a liquid around the tires. The crowd suddenly stood back with shrieks, and the pyre burst into flames. My mum was always fairly delicate, bless her, but I expected some fortitude from the driver. But he started yelling, as though the flames would hear him and put themselves out. The young man who was the sacrificial lamb was oddly silent. No screams or shrieks. It was quietly dignified. As the realization set in, the mob began quickly vanishing, their courage suddenly leaving them, their bloodlust satisfied. They dashed across the street, while some ran along the beach. They would go home and pretend everything was fine. These were street people living on the edge of society. Who could ever identify them? "What can we do?" my mum asked. I was no medical expert, but I was fairly certain the man was dead. "The police will catch up with them," the driver responded. "Call it what you want. Divine intervention. My family are fairly religious." But the heavens opened up, and the rain began to fall. It was torrential. My mum seemed almost grateful, but I didn't see the point. The man would be truly dead. He was past saving. I've always been the pragmatic and unshakable one in the family. As the rain doused the flames, the driver shakily drove off. He and my mother spoke in low tones, as though it would soften the blow of what we just witnessed. My mother was completely shaken. However, I was more concerned with the facts and the way the case against the man was. He had been burned for theft, but wasn't that a bit of an overzealous response? What had caused him to steal in the first place? Poverty? Desperation? I guess it was in this period I learned to look at facts and not respond emotionally to events. How did we know he hadn't done worse? Although that wouldn't have warranted a burning. The crowd had been fueled by their own anger, but more importantly, they fed off the energy of the group. There was a huge gap in the standard of living, and believe it or not, there was no middle class. The upper class existed with jets, helicopter rides, and great opulence. On the other side was the dirt poor. The police had been called from one of the office buildings nearby, but we knew it would be too little too late. The mob would have known they had minutes before help arrived, hence their speed and efficiency. You'd need a battalion to stop an angry mob. None of the locals around at the time were willing to risk life and limb. We never quite understood what made this system acceptable in the eyes of a small minority of people. Was it tribal? We are a deeply tribal country after all. Or was there some darker reason behind it? Back at home, my grandfather's explanation was simple. It wasn't tribal or fueled by some misplaced sense of justice. They were simply criminals, taking their cues from the bloody regime changes in the country. If the people in power could get away with assassinating their enemies under the guise of national security, then why couldn't they? The events made the news, and we watched it that night. People were enraged that a young man had lost his life. Where were the authorities? Where had the local police been? Lots of questions were asked, and it did lead to drastic changes. You will be relieved to know that was the first and last time I witnessed anything that macabre. It was also one of the last incidents of its kind. I hope you've somehow managed to enjoy this story, and it wasn't too jarring for you.